June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. 20,000 feet above the Pacific, the sunlight is fractured by oil smoke. Black pillars rise from the ocean below, twisting through the trade wind haze like columns from some ancient ruin. The drone of engines and the rattle of flak create a metallic thunder that vibrates in the cockpit. Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey, best of Bombing Squadron 6, tilts his SBD Dauntless over into a vertical dive. For an instant, gravity grips him like a fist. Airspeed surges. The altimeter spins backward in a blur. Around him, tracer fire climbs in white threads, each one a possible ending. Below lies the heart of Japan's striking arm. Carriers accompanied by cruisers fanning through the waves. Flak blossoms across the sky, tearing thin holes in the cloud of smoke. Inside his oxygen mask, Best whispers his own calculations, silent precision replacing any prayer. The ocean rushes up. One bomb, one dive. 10 seconds that will cut through the history of the Pacific War. And it all began months before these black plumes ever reached the western horizon. The Pacific in early 1942 bore the weight of near-total Japanese domination. In just 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japan's fleet had carved a crimson arc from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies and deep into the Solomon Islands. Everywhere the rising sun advanced, Allied outposts fell. Singapore had surrendered. The U.S. Army was capitulating on Bataan. The Japanese Navy seemed invincible, disciplined, battle-tested, and wielding carriers that projected striking power farther than any previous armada in history. For the United States, the world had narrowed into caution and recovery. Pearl Harbor's wreckage still lined the shallow harbor floor, twisted silhouettes of what had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet. Yet amid the ruins, a sense of grim purpose hardened. Carriers, not battleships, were now the instruments of survival. The new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, moved quickly. Shipyards worked night and day. Intelligence efforts intensified within a small group of cryptanalysts stationed at Pearl's Hypo code-breaking unit, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. By May, Rochefort's team pierced fragments of the Japanese Navy's complex naval cipher, JN-25. What emerged from those numbers and fragments of radio chatter was the outline of another Japanese strike, a plan centered on a location codenamed AF. The Americans suspected AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny coral speck halfway between Hawaii and Japan, strategically meaningless in area, but decisive in position. Control of Midway would pull the remaining U.S. carriers into open battle, granting Japan the knockout blow it sought. What the Imperial Navy did not realize was that its own secrecy had already been compromised. The U.S. prepared an ambush. Ships refueled, torpedoes rearmed, squadrons briefed. Midway's runways glowed under blackout hoods as ground crews coated bombs and painted markings overnight. Each pilot was reminded that the Pacific's fate could compress into one dawn. Across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded the most powerful naval force ever assembled by Japan. It sailed in 3 prongs: 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, forming the First Air Fleet, accompanied by heavy cruisers, battleships, destroyers, and a screen of support vessels. Yamamoto himself directed this massive operation from his battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles behind, while Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo led the carrier striking group at the tip of the spear. The Japanese plan was elegant in its conception, but brittle in its execution. Midway would be assaulted and captured. The U.S. Navy, when inevitably responding, would be annihilated by superior numbers and aircraft. Confidence bordered on hubris, forged by 6 months of unbroken victories from the Indian Ocean to New Guinea. In contrast, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was running on improvisation and grit. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown formed Task Forces 16 and 17 under Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. Behind them trailed only 2 seaplane tenders, a few destroyers, and a supply of hope. The crews were lean from months of continuous alert. Many aircraft carried patched bullet holes from the Coral Sea. Yet morale was quietly shaped by the code breakers' intelligence. This time, they would strike first. Between May 31st and June 3rd, the Armada steamed east, unseen beneath low weather fronts. Reconnaissance planes crisscrossed the water like anxious insects. Midway's Marines dug in, their airstrip packed with Catalina patrol planes, Army B-17s, and a thin line of Marine dive bombers waiting for an enemy that seemed invincible. At dawn on June 4th, Nagumo's launch decks erupted with the roar of Mitsubishis bound for Midway. Bombs rained on the island moments later. But in choosing to rearm for a second strike, Nagumo's carriers were suddenly caught in the one posture most dangerous to any fleet. Decks cluttered with fuel lines, bombs and planes nowhere near takeoff readiness. Far to the northeast, American carriers had already turned into the wind. Engines coughed to life. Pilots checked altimeters. Fuel lines hissed. Among them sat a squadron commander named Richard Halsey Best. What these men carried into the sky went beyond ordnance. It was the balance of the Pacific itself. There was nothing flamboyant about Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best. A quiet Californian, a Naval Academy graduate of steady temperament, he represented the generation trained in procedures, but hardened by early war chaos. Assigned to bombing Squadron 6 aboard the USS Enterprise, Best drilled his pilots relentlessly. He believed dive bombing was geometry under pressure, that courage without precision was simply noise. Those days aboard Enterprise blurred into a single rhythm: flight deck heat, salt air, and constant instruction. Every maneuver, every angle of descent rehearsed, until instinct replaced thought. When the call for Midway came, many pilots had never felt combat. Best carried them there as their anchor of composure. In a war increasingly defined by technology, it was still a human pulse deciding each outcome. He knew the dive bombers' supremacy depended on timing. Released too soon, the bomb drifted harmlessly. Too late, you followed it into the sea. The difference between legend and oblivion was often one heartbeat. American doctrine before Midway was uncertain. Torpedo squadrons were expected to cripple carriers, while dive bombers finished them off. Reality proved cruel. The slow torpedo. Planes of Torpedo 8, flying straight and low, were massacred. Every one of the 15 aircraft destroyed. Only one man surviving. But their sacrifice dragged Japanese fighters to sea level, leaving the upper sky undefended. From that altitude, Best and the dauntless squadrons would descend. Precise, sudden, unopposed. This was not planned coordination, but the accidental synchronization of courage. The tactic itself was audacious simplicity. The SBD would roll over into a vertical nose-down dive from around 20,000 feet. A split flap acted as an aerodynamic brake to steady the fall. Each pilot then sighted through a simple telescopic sight, aligned the lines on the steaming carrier deck, and held his nerve as the ocean grew vast in the glass. Release came near 2,000 feet, the pilot blacking out briefly during pull-up as blood left his head. Under those conditions, the concept of never missed a shot was not boast, but demand. One could try only once before the guns below turned the sky into confetti. And now that human skill met steel design. The heart of that precision was a sturdy, sometimes underestimated machine. The Douglas SBD Dauntless. On paper, it was already considered obsolete by 1942, slow, heavy, and lightly armed. Yet, the Dauntless possessed what many faster aircraft lacked: stability in the dive. Split dive brakes embedded in the trailing edges of its wings allowed a true 70-degree descent without spiraling into a death roll. The forward-firing 50 caliber guns could strafe, while the rear seat gunner braced against G-forces during pullout. Its structure could absorb violence that tore other bombers apart. Each Dauntless carried a single 1,000-pound bomb under its belly, and two smaller 100-pounders under the wings. The load seemed insignificant against an armored carrier. In practice, the combination of steep impact angle and fuel-covered decks turned each hit into controlled catastrophe. For the U.S. Navy, this modest craft became the spearhead of an entirely new era: vertical warfare. The enemy command angle Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding Japan's First Air Fleet, embodied the old school of carrier warfare. Dominance through coordination, not improvisation. His carriers had devastated Pearl Harbor and Ceylon, but those triumphs reinforced a dangerous rigidity. When Midway's defenders resisted and reports of American activity trickled in, Nagumo wavered between launching a second wave against the island or rearming for fleet combat. Rearming meant disaster. Elevators rattled with torpedoes and bombs, hangar crews worked knee-deep in aviation fuel, and the decks became open reservoirs of volatility. At 10:20 a.m., Nagumo's decks were still cluttered with half-fueled aircraft when his lookouts spotted specks in the northern sky. The order to take evasive action came seconds too late. The moral and psychological angle war compresses morality into seconds. For the Japanese, Midway was meant as the perfect strike of imperial destiny. For the Americans, it was the test of endurance and meaning after humiliation. Each pilot who dove that morning carried not vengeance, but determination, a quiet correction to history. In that instant before descent, no ideology mattered. Only calculation, fear, and the steady need to finish the mission before anti-aircraft shells found their way upward. The opposing fleets shared the same sun, the same ocean, but each believed it owned tomorrow. That illusion would shatter within minutes, under the crosshairs of a single dauntless commander prepared to dive through fire and smoke toward the Kaga. At 10:20 a.m., Bombing Squadron 6 sighted the broad wakes of the Japanese main force. 3 carriers lay below, their decks stippled with fighters climbing into staggered formations. Pilots radioed contact reports, words trembling with static. The enemy fleet, unaware of the unseen threat above, continued turning into the wind. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the strike from USS Enterprise, gave the hand signal. The dauntless bombers rolled into their dives. Air brakes snapped open with a metallic scream. Best watched the blue horizon rotate violently as he followed McCluskey's lead section toward the massive carrier Kaga. The ship filled his sight like a moving target range. Aircraft spotted in neat rows across her deck, bombs and fuel hoses openly looped between. In that split second, tactical purity eclipsed fear. He released his bomb at 1,500 feet, pulled steel against gravity, felt the blackout rush, then recovery. Below, Kaga erupted. Best's bomb struck near the forward elevator, slicing through multiple hangars before detonating among torpedo aircraft being refueled. 2 other bombs from his wingmen hit seconds later. Fuel ignited instantly, sending sheets of fire along the length of the flight deck. Planes, half ready for takeoff, burst open like tinderboxes. Japanese damage control officers fought to douse the inferno, but aviation gasoline snaked through ruptured pipes, feeding flames downward into compartments. Within 10 minutes, secondary explosions consumed corridors and machine rooms. Farther west, another U.S. squadron had mistakenly converged on the same target, leaving Akagi untouched, until Best, reassessing from altitude, saw the oversight. One enemy carrier still maneuvered freely through smoke. He tightened formation and broke away from the dive pattern to correct it. Behind him, the Pacific was littered with burning fragments, the dying Kaga twisting into the wind, her colors still hoisted. In Best's headphones came clipped confirmations. Kaga burning. One hit confirmed. Target aflame. There was no time for triumph. He focused instead on the carrier dead ahead, Akagi, flagship of the Japanese strike force. A target that meant striking at Nagumo himself. Below, Japanese deck officers watched the sequence with disbelief. 4 of their most vital ships appearing under attack from nowhere, torn apart not by massed fleets, but by a handful of relentless dots in the sunlit sky. From 14,000 feet, the Akagi looked deceptively serene. White-topped wake trailing behind a deck painted with the red sun. Best throttled forward, nose dropping through the cloud layer. His wingmen followed in tight pairs, each controlled fall a separate gamble against physics and flak. Anti-aircraft fire enveloped the air like boiling gravel. Black bursts threw jagged shocks across his canopy. The Dauntless shuddered, but stayed true. Best's grip welded to the stick, his gaze anchored on the painted circle amidships. He adjusted slightly for drift, 1/2 degree left. The bomb lock released with an audible click that echoed louder than the guns outside. The 1,000-pounder carved downward, a sliver of steel in sunlight. Next instant, impact amidships near the forward elevator. The bomb punched through 2 decks before detonating alongside a fully fueled strike group waiting below. Fire gushed through ventilation shafts like breath from a furnace. Akagi's interruption was immediate. Her rising aircraft crashed back onto the burning deck. Command bridges smothered by smoke. Vice Admiral Nagumo's staff fled his flag bridge as flame peeled away paint in sheets. Messages crackled in confusion. Bomb hit to port lifeline. Fires uncontrollable. The flagship, nerve center of the entire operation, was mortally wounded by one exacting release. Best pulled into a steep climb, his plane trembling and vibrating, the sea spinning a blur below. Wedged behind him, his gunner, James Murray, shouted through the intercom, voice broken by static. "Direct hit!" Below, Kaga and Soryu were already infernos. Within minutes, Akagi joined them. The Japanese formation that had launched Pearl Harbor ceased to exist as an organized force. Flames lit the morning like a floating sunrise. 3 carriers ablaze in a square of ocean no larger than a city district. On the horizon, the last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, prepared her counterstroke. But the momentum had already shifted irreversibly. Radio operators aboard Enterprise struggled to interpret the surreal reports. 3 carriers burning, struck within 6 minutes. Officers on the bridge stared wordlessly at the transmission log, uncertain whether to believe it. For the Japanese command, disbelief transformed into silence. Reports filtered upward. Multiple carriers have exploded. Officers who had envisioned a Pacific empire watched their decks dissolve under orange fire. Midway's turning point had unfolded not through massed fleets, but through the focus of a few men diving into smoke. The smoke that hung over the Pacific that afternoon could be seen for more than 100 miles. For hours, the sea around Midway burned, a new geography drawn by intersecting oil slicks and rising steam. By early evening, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu lay gutted, their survivors plucked from debris fields by destroyers already filling with wounded. Hiryu had struck back briefly, mortally damaging Yorktown, yet by twilight she too was caught and set ablaze by another dauntless squadron. The battle was decided. 4 Japanese carriers gone, more than 300 aircraft destroyed, 2,000 sailors and aviators lost. Irreplaceable veterans of the Empire's proudest arm. Japan's tactical advance would never again match its early war confidence. Aboard USS Enterprise, There was elation tempered by exhaustion. Pilots who had survived the dives removed their oxygen masks in stunned quiet, faces ghosted with salt and sweat. They had flown through the hardest sky the Pacific could invent, and against every calculation, returned. Lieutenant Commander Best, whose exacting precision had opened the wound through Akagi, barely comprehended the scale of what had occurred. His oxygen system had malfunctioned during the final dives. Unknown to him, he had inhaled dangerous fumes of sodium hydroxide. Within days, his lungs would begin failing, forcing his evacuation and the abrupt end of his flying career. Yet before grounding, he had done what few pilots in all of warfare accomplished. In a single morning, scoring direct hits on 2 fleet carriers. One of them, Japan's flagship. The statistics could never fully render the human price. One pilot's ascendancy paid for by countless others' sacrifice across the waves. As night descended, burning hulls turned the water into wide rings of light, reflections flickering like funeral torches for an empire at its high tide. But even fires at sea fade into horizon shadows, and the meaning of their glow would emerge in bureaucratic reports and calm reassessments that followed. The shock in Tokyo was profound. Reports filtered back to naval headquarters describing the loss of the First Air Fleet, the same force that had humbled the Allies from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. At first, higher command dismissed the American cable intercepts as exaggeration. But when fragments of timeline, eyewitness statements, and rescue logs aligned, disbelief yielded to quiet dread. For Japan, the core of its offensive power, 4 veteran carrier groups and the trained air crews within, was gone. These were not ships that could be replaced quickly. They were flying colleges of experience, their destruction hollowing out the naval air arm. From that moment, strategic initiative transferred irrevocably to the United States. American shipyards and factories, already spooling into industrial overdrive, now enjoyed time and morale. New Essex-class carriers were under construction, air group training refined, radar expanded. Midway was more than a battle. It was an acceleration point. Admiral Yamamoto accepted responsibility in silence. His once brilliant plan had been undone by a handful of code breakers and pilots guided by instinct and endurance. He would remain haunted by the knowledge that his bold gamble, designed to annihilate the American carrier force, had instead crippled his own. For the men of Enterprise, there was no celebration, only weary comprehension. They had survived a fight that felt mathematically impossible. Letters were written home in the faint light of ready rooms. Deck crews washed the remaining dauntlesses free of oil and salt, counting the bullet holes, each one an almost invisible equation of odds. When Enterprise turned for Pearl Harbor, the flight deck was scarred and silent, but morale glowed. The blackened carriers behind them were more than wrecks. They were proof that courage combined with precision could bend even the trajectory of empires. And beyond those embers waited reflection on the strange symmetry of technology, resolve, and chance that had defined Midway's sky. On the vast silence of the Pacific, the winds that once carried warplanes now brushed over empty coordinates. Beneath them rested 4 hulls that had changed the rhythm of the world. The Battle of Midway was neither lengthy nor grand in numbers, yet within a few hours it had redrawn the psychological map of the war. For Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, destruction arrived not in waves, but in moments measured by precision. For Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best, that precision was both vocation and fate. His exacting nature had transformed a dive into an act of geometry that altered history. He never flew again after Midway. The chemical burns to his lungs left him grounded, but his legacy remained airborne in every naval aviator trained thereafter to balance calm calculation with instinct. Midway taught simpler, unchanging truths: that intelligence can outweigh size, that resolve can outlast arrogance, and that history often pivots on seconds invisible to those living them. Japanese commanders who looked across the water that afternoon saw not only devastation, but a reflection of their own perfectionism turned fragile. In that moment, two nations' philosophies of war collided. The precision of the samurai spirit met by the precision of industrial discipline. The Dauntless became a symbol of controlled bravery, a machine built for descent, whose strength lay in committing fully to an irreversible dive. That image, of pilots cutting through their own fear and gravity toward a target shimmering in smoke, endures as one of the war's stark truths. When the embers of the Pacific cooled, Best returned quietly to civilian life, his lungs scarred but his mind steady. He seldom spoke of the morning that shifted the tides, yet every cadence of the post-war Navy, every new generation of carrier pilots, inherited part of that 10-second window over Akagi. The world that emerged after Midway was different, more balanced, more uncertain, and permanently aware that a single act of precision can remake an ocean. In the measured calm after the storm, the Pacific lay still, as if holding its breath, its surface reflecting both loss and the faint outline of men who once dived through fire and never missed their mark.